this tombstone, there are three names on this one. First, you have Henry Lowry's daddy, Allen, on this side. On this side is Henry Lowry's brother, William. And on this side was Henry Lowry's mother, Mary. The reason I bring groups here, William, most people don't realize, was the leader of the Lowry Gang when it began at the time of the Civil War. He was 32 years old. He was unmarried, but he did have at least one child that he did have, a lady had for him. But he and his daddy Allen were arrested by the Home Guard. The Home Guard were the whites that didn't go off and fight during the Civil War. A lot of it was plantation owners that didn't want to go off and fight. They paid for other people to go off and fight in their place. But they stayed here to kind of rule the county. They were known as the Home Guard, Robeson County Home Guard. And in the end of the Civil War, from January, February, March of 1865, the people in this area in the Confederate Army, they knew the Civil War was ending, and they knew that they were going to be defeated. But things were happening here that they finally found out about. There were Union soldiers that escaped from a prison camp in Florence, South Carolina. And there's a story behind that. One of them was named Ord Norman, and he was actually taken from Andersonville, Georgia. It was a large prison camp down in Georgia for Union soldiers, and it makes history that a lot of people died there because of the poor way they were treated. But Ord Norman was given opportunity, some of the other men. They said, we're going to take you to Wilmington, we're going to transfer, we're going to switch prisoners. The North will get some of you, and we're going to get some of our Confederate soldiers back. Well, instead of taking them to Wilmington to do that, they took them to Florence. There in South Carolina, they had built a new prison camp in Florence, and so they put them there. Well, after about 3 months, they said, we're going to take you now finally to Wilmington. And on the way from Florence to Wilmington, they stopped in Wideville, North Carolina, on a train to feed the men that were on the train, the prisoners. But Ord Norman and 3 of the other men escaped. And guess where they come to trying to head north? They come through Robeson County. And in the swamps, they met up with the Lowry Gang that was hiding in the swamps, and the Lowry Gang took them in. So from the beginning of the Lowry War, these 4 Union soldiers, became a part of the Lowry Gang. And Henry Lowry and William took them to their father's house, which was about 100 yards past us behind here. And I've read a diary that Ord Norman kept. And in that diary, he wrote about how the Lowrys fed him and how good they were to him. But they went with the Lowrys down into their den in the swamp, back swamp, which is called Devil's Den. And the Confederate and the Home Guard soldiers here knew about that. They found out about it. And so they came around in this area and they arrested as many Indians as they could. And they took them to a home about 2 miles away over in the Raymond community and locked them up in a smokehouse. And they tried Allen and William and found them guilty of harboring Union soldiers and stealing food and hogs from the Confederate soldiers' homes. And so they took Allen and William back to their house, and they made them dig their own grave, and they executed them. And it said that Henry Lowry was lying in the woods and watched it as a 17-year-old boy. He watched this happen to his daddy and his brother. And it says that the Home Guard men went back to the place where they had arrested the rest of the family and started telling them about how we've killed your husband, we've killed your son, told Miss Mary that. And said they were joking and playing around with them, making them feel bad. Well, next day they released all those people. All of them come back, and they dug up the body of Allen and William, and they brought them here, and they buried them here on this site. And this is Allen's here, this is William, and then this is Mary here. They're pointing east. Their feet are pointing to the east. We bury our people to the east. We believe that when the Bible says when Jesus comes back, he's going to break the eastern sky. The Bible tells you the dead in Christ will rise first, and that's why we bury our people with their feet pointing east. So when they raise, they're facing east. So they'll be facing that way when God comes back, when Jesus comes. And we also plant cedar trees in our cemeteries. Cedar is one of the 4 sacred herbs among our people. You have cedar, you have tobacco, you have sage, and you have sweetgrass. But a cedar is an herb of healing. And we believe that if you're sick when you die, with cancer and any kind of disease, when you die and you go to heaven, you're not sick anymore. You're already been healed. So these are the graves of Allen and William, and they were killed in March of 1865. They were supposedly killed about 4 days before General Sherman marched through this area. You know, he'd come up through Atlanta and South Carolina and destroyed Atlanta and places in South Carolina, Savannah and Charleston. When he got to North Carolina, weren't quite as bad because he knew that North Carolina was one of the last states that joined the Confederacy and went on to fight during the Civil War. When he come through here, it is believed that some of the Indian people helped him get through the swamps in Robeson County, because I've written in stories that he wrote about how swampy it was here in this part of North Carolina. But our people helped him get through the swamps. And some of those Union soldiers that were with the Lowry Gang supposedly left and went on with Sherman. Now, Ord Norman that I talked about, he was not allowed to do that. Our people believe that Ord Norman was killed in one of the raids that the Lowry Gang committed at a place called the McNair Plantation going into Maxton. But I found out just a few years ago, there was a man from Phoenix, Arizona. He works at the University of Phoenix. He came to visit me, and he asked me that I'd ever heard of a man named Ord Norman. And I told him, yeah. I said about who he was. And when I got done telling him about him, he said, well, all of that you told me, part of it's true, and he said, part of it's not. And I said, what do you mean? He said, I am a descendant of Ord Norman. I said, say he had kids when he was in the army and stuff here? He said, no. He said, Ord Norman didn't die until the early 1900s. So that means that he didn't die in 1865 when he was fighting with the Lowrys. He gave me a picture of Ord Norman and a copy of his diary. Ord Norman had kept a diary, and in that diary he wrote that when the McNair Plantation was raided, that he didn't go. He was sick and he stayed in the swamp, the camp called the Devil's Den. But there was one of the white men that went with him. One of the Union soldiers was killed and the gang buried him. But Ord Norman wrote in the diary that in early March, the gang came back to the den, and they were all sad and crying and upset. They were real angry. And they told him that Allen and William had just been murdered. And they said that Henry Lowry's brother Calvin and another man named John Dial that lived in the area, Henry Lowry wanted them to take Ord Norman to a lady's house in Lumberton named Amanda Nash, who supposedly helped the Indians as much as she could. They put him on a canoe and took him to Lumberton on the river and dropped him off at her house. Well, the Confederates found out about it, the Home Guard found out about it, and they supposedly went by that house to see if he had been shot. They knew if he'd been shot, he was probably the one that was with the Lowry Gang when they raided the McNair Plantation. They found him in that house, Amanda Nash's house. They brought him out of the house, and they realized he had not been shot. But it says that they beat him up real bad, and they took him to Lumberton and dumped him on the courthouse steps in front of Lumberton, where the steps still are at today. And in Ord Norman's diary, he wrote that somebody come by, and people would come by and throw trash at him, they'd throw food at him and hit him. But he said one day somebody come by and picked him up and took him home. And he didn't tell any names, he didn't want to give any names, but he said that a few weeks later, the Union Army, after the war was over, the Union Army come back and got him and took him home. He was from Indiana. And he lived to be an older man, and he moved away out west, and he died out west, and he's buried in Dodge City, Kansas. That's where he's buried at. So that changed the whole thing we'd ever heard about. He was the only one of those white men we knew a name of, Ord Norman. But his descendant brought me a picture of him and a picture of Amanda Nash, the white lady that he had stayed with in Lumberton. So that's the story of Allen and William, how they unfortunately were killed and murdered. But the Indians brought them here. They said they come and dug them up, washed them, and cleaned their bodies, and they brought them here and they buried them here. And if you ever notice, we're buried on a hill. And our people knew about the Carolina bays that exist here in Robeson County. In Robeson County, there are over 8,000 Carolina bays. And we bury our dead on hills. So those bays are just water places where the water stands. During the flooding that we've had recently with some of the storms, you can really tell these Carolina bays now. The largest one is up in St. Paul's, but all around Robeson County, you can see, if you look at that aerial map of Robeson County, you can see these Carolina bays. They look shaped like an egg, and one part of them, the largest part, comes from the northwest, and the smallest part points towards the southeast. But our people know that we bury our dead on hills. If you look out this way, you'll see these are Carolina bays down below us here. So we knew not to bury our dead there where their graves would be flooded. Yep. Now, Henry Lowry's brother Mary, one day after Allen and William were killed, she was taken by the Home Guard and tied up, and they told her to tell them some information about these Union soldiers, and they threatened to kill her if she didn't. It said that she didn't tell them anything, but they fired their guns over her head, that she supposedly fainted, passed out. Henry Ray Lowry's brother Sinclair and Calvin, they came and found her and got her back home. But years later, it was a lot of time later before she ever died, so she's buried here with her husband and her son that were murdered by the Home Guard. Henry Ray Lowry and Rhoda built a cabin after they married, and their cabin was over on the other side of what's now Highway 74. It was close to what is known as Back Swamp, and it was not far away from where Henry Ray Lowry and his gang had their camp called the Devil's Den. But that's where Henry Ray Lowry and his wife Rhoda lived. At one time they were attacked in that house when they had their kids, and the group thought they were going to be able to, actually end the Lowry War this time by killing Henry Ray Lowry and some of his gang that was there with him, and arresting them or killing them. But they didn't know that Henry Ray Lowry had built a tunnel under his cabin that went about 50 feet out into the swamp, the back swamp, and that was where he was able to get himself out of there and his family and his kids out of the house without having to come out of the door and be shot by the county militia that was hiding around the house. And they were able to get out, and he was able to get his wife and kids to some of the family to help him. And him and his other men, they attacked a group of men who had been surrounded to come help with the ones that had surrounded the Lowry house. They'd been made to come fight. One of the men that was killed was named Giles Inman, and he was not one of the ones that wanted to fight the Lowrys, but he was forced to come join the group that had the Lowrys captured in the house. They thought they had him captured in the house. And after that, he was killed. It says that Henry Ray Lowry went to Giles Inman's father and apologized that his son was killed, but he said that he had no choice, that he was defending his wife and his kids, and that anybody that came against them, they had to fight. They had to take whatever was dealt to them. This is called a Carolina Bay. A lot of people don't know why it's called a Carolina Bay. They think it's called that because it has water in it. It's actually called a Carolina Bay because bay trees grow down in there, because it's a real moist area. Carolina Bay supposedly happened when an asteroid struck the Earth hundreds and thousands of years ago and created these little, up around what's considered the Midwest, and little darts of it, little pieces of it broke off and cut down through here, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and it dug out these areas. That's why they're called Carolina Bays. And in the springtime, when you see the farmers go out and go to disting up the land, getting ready to plant, you can tell these Carolina Bays. If you look out and you got a low spot like this, right in the center will be dark dirt, real dark soil, and around a rim around it will be whiter soil, like sand soil, like in the ocean. It'll be the sand like you see at the ocean. But that's how you notify, you can know that's a Carolina Bay. Over the years, with a lot of flooding and land shifting and moving, these Carolina Bays, some of them are starting to fill up. They're not as deep as they are now. Lake Waccamaw, a lot of people consider a Carolina Bay. So among our people, we know that these places that we shouldn't bury our dead there, because we don't want their bodies to be underwater, or their graves or possibly caskets that will pop out of the ground. So we bury them on these hilltops. So we're respecting our people even after they're passed away. We're still respecting those. Now, Henry Ray Lowry has a couple of brothers that are also buried here. His brother Sinclair is buried here. He's got a brother James Lowry that's buried over here. And I descend through his brother James Lowry. And I also descend through his brother William that's buried here as well. William that was killed with his father. But after William and Henry, they committed some things during the Lowry War before he was ever killed. James P. Barnes and James Brantley Harris were killed by William and Henry. But after that, in March, when William was killed, Henry Ray Lowry became the leader of the gang, 17-year-old boy, and he began to lead the rest of the men that were in the gang. This is the grave site of Henderson Oxendine. Henderson Oxendine was one of the Lowry Gang. In the Lowry Gang, after William was killed, Henry Ray Lowry became the leader of the gang. He was a 17-year-old boy. Other members of the gang, he had two brothers who were also in the gang, Steve and Tom. And they had two cousins who were in the gang, Henderson and his brother Calvin Oxendine. They were gang members as well. Two of Henry Ray Lowry's brother-in-laws, Andrew and Boss Strong, were also members of the gang. There was two other Indians in the gang, John Dial, 14-year-old boy, which Boss Strong, he was also 14. And William Chavis was another Indian member of the gang. There were two black members of the gang. One was George Applewhite, who married Henderson Oxendine and Calvin's sister Betsy. The other one was Shoemaker John. And the white guy in the gang was named Zachariah McLaughlin. But Henderson was the only gang member that was ever captured and hung. He was executed. It was in 1871, probably early spring. Henderson and Oxendine and George Applewhite, they came out of the swamp, and they wanted to go to George Applewhite's home, where he could spend time with his family, his wife and his kids, which were also related to Henderson. So Henderson went with him. They went to the cabin, which is over near where Strike It to Win is held at. And they said they spent all day. They said the wife, she cooked them some breakfast and lunch and dinner. They probably had fried chicken and pasta and all that good food, some grits and eggs and sausage. And it said about dark, getting close to dark, said George Applewhite come to Henderson and said, Henderson, we better head back to the swamp. Somebody might have found out we're here, the county militia. They might be headed this way or something if they ever find out. But Henderson said, you know what, I'm going to stay tonight. George Applewhite still tried to persuade him, but Henderson said, no, you go ahead, I'm going to stay tonight. He said, I haven't slept on a bed in a long time. I'm going to stay tonight. So they said George Applewhite went ahead. He went on back to the swamp. He said he told Henderson, said, you stay here if you want to, but I'm going on back to the swamp. Well, Henderson stayed the night. It was his sister was there, and he had two nieces that were there, and he had a younger brother there whose name was Pop Oxendine. But it says in the middle of the night, they were living in a log cabin. It said in the middle of the night, Henderson heard a noise outside the cabin, and he opened up the wooden shutters and said he peeked out, and he seen about 25, 30 men circling the cabin, and it was the county militia. Sure enough, they'd found out that they was there, and they'd heard that he had stayed, and they were circling the cabin. They were going to get him. And when I bring groups of kids to it, I said, why don't Henderson just grab his gun and go to shoot and try to get out of there? And they say, well, yeah, that's what we should have done. That's what he should have done. But I tell them, Henderson Oxendine, here's what he done instead. He went on back to bed. Said he went back to bed, went back to sleep. That morning, when the sun rose up, the county militia rushed in and they arrested him. They took him to Lumberton and they locked him up. And I've heard in oral history, this is why that happened. The Lowry Gang was captured 3 or 4 times, and they always escaped. One time they were captured and taken to Lumberton and locked up. 2 or 3 months later, they escaped. One time they were taken to Widewood and locked up again. 2 or 3 months later, they escaped. And one time they were taken to Wilmington and locked up. That's where they said Rhoda came and brought a cake with a file in it, and they were able to file out the cells and get out. But they escaped there as well. Before they ever had trials, they always escaped. Well, Henderson said, you know what? They locked me up in Lumberton. 2 or 3 months, I get a bed to sleep in. I get 3 meals a day, and I ain't got nobody hunting and shooting at me. So he said, after 2 or 3 months, I can break out of the jail and just go back to fighting, go back with the gang and go back to fighting. Well, that was Henderson's plan. He said, well, this ain't too bad then. So that's what his plans was. Well, the county militia and the political people there in Lumberton, they realized we always capture this gang. We always keep them 2 or 3 months before we ever have their trial, and they always escape. So this time they decided, after 2 weeks, they had Henderson's trial. And he was found guilty of murdering Sheriff Reuben King. Sheriff Reuben King was murdered by George Applewhite, who was Henderson Oxendine's brother-in-law. Henderson Oxendine was found guilty of that, which he didn't do. And he was said, in 2 days we're going to hang him. So they're in Lumberton. They had a scaffold, and they planned to hang Henderson Oxendine. It says they brought him out that morning. They walked him up the steps. And before they brought him out, they said that people started gathering underneath where the scaffold was at. They said it was white men gathering. They said women were bringing kids. They were bringing picnic baskets and blankets where they could sit on them and watch this hanging. It was like going to a concert, an outdoor concert. They were coming to watch a member of the Lowry Gang be hanged because they were so afraid of the Lowry Gang. They heard about all the things that the Lowry Gang had done. They wanted to see one of them hung, and they brought their kids to watch this. And they said there was hundreds of them just waiting there to watch this. Well, if you ever watched a movie about a hanging, there's always a preacher or a priest that brings the man out, and they walk him up the steps, stand them there, and they ask them to do anything that you want. Anything you want to say, anything you want to do before we hang you. You're given this one chance to do this. They asked Henderson Oxendine that, and he said, yes, could somebody please go to the nearest church and bring back a bunch of songbooks, hymnals, church hymnals. And it says that the preacher kind of looked at him and said, "What? You want songbooks from the church?" And said, Henderson said, "Yes, but could you please do that?" So this was his last request, and they said, "We'll do it." They said the preacher sent some boys to go to the nearest church and bring back songbooks. Henderson asked would they pass them out to the people and give him one. And when they done that, Henderson Oxendine sung 2 songs out of the songbook. The first one's the song I've never heard. It's called "Shall I Yet Delay?" But the second song that he sung out of it is one, if you ever go to church, you hear this song, "Amazing Grace." They said he sung "And Shall I Yet Delay?" and then "Amazing Grace." And they said Henderson Oxendine was a great singer. He could sing. And they said after he sung those 2 songs, he handed the church hymnal back to the preacher. And they said the preacher was just amazed at how he could sing. Now the group that had come to see him says most of them, the women and the kids and some of the men, said they packed up their stuff and they left. They said this was not what they had wanted to see. That this man had got up and sung gospel songs, and he was not the kind of person they thought he was because he was in. They thought he was a murderer, a killer. But they said they realized that that man was not like that. Henderson Oxendine was not like that. So they didn't want their kids to see this man hung. So they gathered up and they left. And it says only a few men were left. They went ahead with the hangings. They put the noose around his neck. They hung him. And it says a few hours later, his family was given the permission to come get his body. Family brought his body back to the Pembroke area. They said they washed it, cleaned it up, and they brought him here and they buried him here. They planted this tree here when he was buried. This is a cedar tree. Again, one of the 4 sacred herbs. Cedar, tobacco, sage, and sweet grass. They planted this tree here. But there was 2 other things they also put here. And if you look down, you'll see these stones. These are called stones that traditionally people say if you find this stone, you're supposed to keep it and put it at your burial site. Your family's supposed to keep it and put it at your burial site. These stones, they say, nobody knows where they come from. I've heard farmers say that they go out to their land to farm or out in their yard at their house. They go out and they see these stones just laying there. They don't know where they come from. Did they pop up out of the ground? Did they fall out of the sky? Nobody knows. But our people say that they consider it a burial stone. It says that Henderson found this small one when he was a little boy, and his family kept it to put it at his grave site. And right before he passed away, a few months before, that he found this big one. And so when he was hung and died, the family brought those 2 tombstones and put here and planted this tree to mark his burial site. Okay? Remember, like I spoke before, his feet are pointing east. Where when the dead in Christ shall rise, the Bible says they'll face, when they raise up, they face east when Jesus comes back. Now, Henderson was never married, but he had 2 ladies that had kids for him. One was a Cummins, and the other ladies was a Jacobs. And their sons took their last names. They took their mother's last names instead of their daddy's last name. Instead of being Oxendines, one was a Cummins and the other was a Jacobs. And years now, they've come here and they started putting in these 2 tombstones. The first one here was put in probably around 1985, 1986, somewhere in there. And the other one was brought in right after the year 2000. So it kind of showed that they descend through Henderson Oxendine. But that's the story of Henderson Oxendine. He was the only gang member that was ever executed, being hung. Supposedly he was the last man legally hung in the state of North Carolina. And I say legally hung, because we know during the civil rights and all that stuff was going on in the 1960s, 1950s, there were a lot of blacks that were hung illegally. They were taken out and hung by the KKK. But Henderson was the first legal person to be hung, the last one to be hung in the state of North Carolina. So that's the story of Henderson Oxendine.
Now, what was there before the headstones? Was it just the burial stones?
Just the burial stones and the cedar tree that they planted. Yep. Unfortunately, a lot of our people, if they're not got the money to do this kind of thing, 1870s, if they're buried around that time, if you don't have a lot of money to put down a tombstone, you had to mark it some other way. There are some other graves that have these burial stones that the person that's buried there supposedly found them. And that's why a lot of the ones that died, Henry Lowry's brother Steve and Tom, Andrew Strong that was killed, Zachariah McLaughlin that was killed, there's no tombstone anywhere marking where they died at. So, but I'm glad that Henderson was kept record of where he passed away and where he died and what happened to him. This is the grave of Rhoda Strong. Rhoda Strong was the wife of Henry Berry Lowry. Two of Rhoda's brothers, Andrew and Boss, were also in the Lowry Gang. A lot of people don't know this, but the Strong last name was a made-up name. Rhoda's father, his name was John Strong. When he came here, he changed. Well, his real name was John Gorman, but he murdered somebody in the mid part of North Carolina, up I think or close to around Asheboro, and he escaped there and come down here to hide around in the swamps here in Robeson County. He married into the Indian community, and he changed his last name from John Gorman to John Strong. And he married a Lowry girl, and Rhoda and Andrew and Boss are his kids that descend from his marriage. And so that last name of Strong is a made-up name. But she married Henry Berry Lowry. Now, she was buried here in 1909, and what I like to do is tell people about kind of the end of the Lowry War for Henry Berry Lowry. In February of 1872, the Lowry Gang decided they were going to rob a store in the town of Lumberton. It was called the Pope and McLeod store. At that time, the town of Lumberton did not have a bank. All the other little businesses would bring their money to the Pope and McLeod store, and the Pope and McLeod store owners would put it in a safe that they had there at the store. Well, there was a guy that worked there. His name was Frank McKay, and I didn't mention this earlier at Henderson's grave, but Frank McKay was one of the guys. He worked for the different jobs in Lumberton. He worked at the Pope and McLeod, but at times he also worked for the police department there. He was known as the hangman. He was the one that put the hood and put the noose around Henderson Oxenine's neck the day he was hung. Frank McKay. Well, the gang got up with Frank McKay in February of 1872. And it said that they kind of told him that they were going to forgive him for what he had done. They knew he was just working. He was having to do that for what he had done to Henderson Oxenine. But what they asked him was if he knew the clue, the for the safe to get in it, if he knew the combination for the safe. And he did know the combination of the safe. So they told him, what we'll do, if you give us the combination of the safe, when we break in and get the money out, we'll give you some of the money. But so nobody will never know that you've done this. So guess what? Frank McKay said, yes, I'll do it. It says that Frank McKay gave them the combination for the safe, but it's oral history now that after he gave them the combination for the safe, that the Lowry Gang, they put a double-barrel shotgun under his chin and they blowed his face off. And they took him over to Union Chapel and they hid him in the woods there near Henry Berry Lowry's brother Tom, who lived there in Union Chapel behind a church over there called Evergreen Church. He hid him there in the woods. And they went on to Lumberton to the Pope and McLeod store. They carried a horse and a wagon. They got into the store, and since they had the combination to the safe, they were able to open the safe and take out the money, which was supposed to have been around $20,000, which back then that would have been a lot of money. That's almost close to $500,000 today. They took that out. On the way out of Lumberton, they decided to stop by the sheriff's office. They knew he had a safe. They didn't know the combination for his safe, but they did take the safe. They took his safe out, put it in the wagon, and traveling from Lumberton, they traveled the highway across where the railroad track runs, because that railroad track was in at the time, it was built at the time. They were following along the railroad track to come back to Pembroke, over the Union Chapel community to Tom Lowry's house. Where it says, if you ever travel down Highway 72, across the railroad track there where the Bloodweiser plant's at, they said around there where that plant's at today, that's where their wagon broke down, because it was carrying that heavy safe. They said that they had to take dynamite and blow that safe open. This is around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. They took the money out, any coins that was left, and they took all that money, and they came to Tom Lowry's house there behind Evergreen Church in Union Chapel community. And they said that some of them had their wives to meet them there. They needed help, counting up this money. And it says that, and they walked in with probably around $25,000. They got $20,000 from the Pope and McLeod store, around $5,000 from the sheriff's office. And it says that the women, when they walked in with this money, the women were just so excited, $25,000. And said that some of the women were going to cook them up some breakfast. Some of them were going to help the men count. Well, Henry told them, he said, y'all do this. He said, I'm going to go back down through the woods and watch, make sure nobody was following us. So they said he went about just a few hundred yards away from the house, down into the woods, and was going to watch and make sure nobody had followed them out of Lumberton. It is said that after about 30 minutes, they heard a loud gunshot. Boom! He said all the people in the house, the women just got all excited. They started screaming and yelling. And said the men grabbed their guns and they all went running towards where they'd heard the gunshot. So when they got there, there was a body laying there in the woods. And the women looked at it and they looked at the clothes that was on it. And they said, that's Henry's clothes. And then when they looked where the face was at, there was no face. The face had been blown off. And the men told him, said it looked like he was cleaning his double-barrel gun. And it might have left a bullet in it by mistake and it might have went off. And that it blowed his face off. And they said they took up that body. They wrapped it up. They went there to Union Chapel. The Oxendine man there that was a carpenter. They had him to put the body in a casket that he had there. And they brought the casket from Union Chapel this way. This was now early in the morning, around 6, 7 o'clock in the morning. And they brought it through here. And they brought it here and they buried that body, that casket. There's a sandbar down here in the river that runs right behind us. And the river was low at that time so you could see the sandbar. And they buried that casket in the sandbar. And they said, don't tell anybody about this casket here. Don't tell anybody, because if the white man knew about it, they could come there and dig it up and take the body in and get the reward. But they said, don't tell anybody about the body there. So everybody just started passing word that Henry Lowry had accidentally killed himself and that they didn't know where he was buried at. They didn't know where he'd been taken to or anything. So that was the word that went around to the people. And that happened in February of 1872. And so for years, everybody thought that that's what happened. Henry Lowry accidentally killed himself. The Lowry War went on for 2 more years. It finally ended in around 1874. Well, before that supposedly happened, Henry Lowry accidentally killed himself. Federal troops had been sent here from Washington, D.C. to help fight the Lowry Gang, to try to end the Lowry War. One of the guys that came was a general for them. His last name was Gorman. And when he got here, he saw Rhoda Strong, or Rhoda Lowry's father, whose name was considered John Strong. He saw this man, and he says that they both realized, and they hadn't seen one another in years, but they were actually kin. They were supposedly first or second cousins. And Francis Marion Wishart, who was head of the county militia, he kept a diary about the time when he was head of the county militia, and he wrote down every day something that happened with the Lowry War, about where he was sending men to look for the Lowry Gang, if the Lowry Gang had robbed this plantation or that plantation across the county. He was always writing down everything, and he was telling about how tough it was to try to end the Lowry War. But one time in there, he was telling about the general of the federal troops has been missing for about 3 days. And we're thinking that he possibly was caught by the Lowry Gang, and he might have been killed. Well, at the end of those 3 days, the next day, the General Gorman showed back up here in Pembroke. It was known then as Bowie's store. And says Francis Marion Wishart asked him where he had been. And he said he had been at Henry Lowry's mother's house, Mary, over in the Hopewell community. He said he had been there. And said Francis Marion Wishart was wondering how come you hadn't been killed. And he said that Mary had fed him and took care of him, and he'd just been there talking to her. And he'd been trying to meet up with some of the gang to try to get them to give themselves up. But he didn't tell them about his connection with Rhoda's daddy. He didn't spread his connection with Rhoda's daddy. He didn't want them to know that. So it is believed, and it is told among our people, that the gang gave Henry Lowry all of the money, that he tried to get them to leave. He said, all of us just leave. We can't take our families, can't take our kids. We need to be able to leave right now. And he said after a year or so, we might be able to come back and get our families, but we can't take them with us right now, because it'd be hard to get away with all these women and kids. It'd be easier just for the men. But it is said that the rest of the men told Henry Lowry that this is the only land I know. This is the only land I know. That's where Dr. Adolph Dial got the name of his book from. They said, this is the only land I know, the only land we know, and we want to stay here. But it says that Henry said, I got to go. He said he knew that times were winding down, because Henderson Oxendine had already been killed. Zachariah McLaughlin had already been killed. John Dial and George Applewhite had been shot several times. John Dial and Shoemaker John had been made to leave. William Chavis had left. He'd left the gang. He was gone. And Henry Lowry knew that things were tightening up, that things were going. Bounty hunters were coming from all over. And he said, eventually we're going to be, the gang's going to be killed. So when he decided that he wanted to leave, it is said that the gang gave him the $25,000 and that John Gorman supposedly helped him escape. He says that sometimes the federal soldiers would be wounded in a battle with the Lowry Gang, and they would get on a train there in what's now Pembroke, and they'd get on that train, and the train would take them back to Washington, D.C. And it said that there was one man got on the train and his face was all wrapped up, and the word was that he had been shot in the face, and to kind of help him survive that shot, his face had been wrapped up to keep it from getting infected. Now the story among our people is that that man was actually Henry Berry Lowry, that the General Gorman had helped him escape and leave Robeson County, and that's how he got away. He got on that train and left the county, and supposedly never came back to fight anymore in the Lowry War. And so a lot of people don't believe that story, but among my people we believe that, and we've heard that story. Now, when Rhoda died in 1909, they were having her funeral, and my great-grandfather, he was here, he was her nephew. He was probably, I think he was around 27, 28 years old, and they were here having the funeral. And he said after the funeral, some of them were still standing here talking, but he said during the funeral he had noticed there was a man standing over in the edge of the woods. If you look over, you'll see the hills going down to the river. Some of the other Lowry brothers that were here went over to that man and said they were hugging and talking, and said they stayed there only just a few minutes talking to him. And then when they come back, my great-granddaddy said he asked his daddy who was that man. And said his daddy told him, said, "Son, that was your Uncle Henry Berry." Now my great-granddaddy said, he told him, he said, "Daddy, we were always told that Henry Berry Lowry accidentally killed himself cleaning his gun." And his daddy told him, he said, "Son, I'm going to tell you now that actually Henry Berry Lowry left the county, and that when he heard about Rhoda had died, there was 10 of the family knew where he was at. And their job was to always let him know when somebody died in the family, and he could come back to the burial if he wanted to. So when Rhoda died, his wife, they notified him, and he was able to get back here before she was buried. And that was him over there in the woods, and it had come to the funeral. He said that after all of them hugged his neck, that he left and went off into the river and was gone, because he couldn't let it be known that he was around here so people could know about him, that he had come to his wife's funeral. Among our people, it's believed that he actually lived in Tennessee, around Knoxville, Tennessee, and we believe that he probably remarried after Rhoda died. And there are probably there's some people there that have contacted and said that they descend through who they think was Henry Berry Lowry, that on his deathbed he told them who he really was and where he came from. And so that's part of, some people don't believe that story, but our people do. My family believe that story. But in 1923, the last time Henry Berry Lowry was seen in Robeson County, that he came, there was a house over near the Hopewell community, the house that still stands. They said that in 1923 he pulled up in the yard of that house driving a Cadillac. At this time he was probably in his mid-70s, and said that he told the people there that, this will probably be my last time ever coming home. And that when he left, he told them all goodbye, that he'd probably never be back. And so that kind of ends the whole Lowry story. A lot of people believe that he accidentally killed himself while he was cleaning his gun, accidentally shot himself while he was cleaning his gun. But I believe that he did survive, that he went away, and that when some of his family members would die, like his wife died, he came back and showed the love that he had for her and his family that passed away. So that's the story of Henry Berry Lowry.
So the bounty was never collected, but do you mind talking about the reward? Like, I know you were talking about
Oh yeah, the bounty on Henry Berry Lowry's head was never collected. Most of the other gang members that were shot and killed or hung like Henderson was, the bounty was collected on them. Most of them was around $6,000, I always heard, around $6,000, $7,000. Henry Berry Lowry's was the highest, supposedly around $25,000. At that time, the other highest bounty in the United States was that of Jefferson Davis, who had been the president of the Confederacy. And the next highest in the United States was Henry Berry Lowry's. And after Henry Berry Lowry, the next highest bounty was outlaw Jesse James. And it's often said that Jesse James, sometime when he committed a crime out in Missouri and all these other places, those states out there, that he would tell people that his name was Henry Berry Lowry, that he was confessing to be Henry Berry Lowry. because he had heard about Henry Berry Lowry and what the Lowry Gang had done here in Robeson County. And the Lowry Gang, the Lowry War had been fought from during the time of the Civil War all the way up until the last member was killed in 1874. So you're looking at around 13 years of actually the Lowry War lasted.